Yeah, that's such an important thing that you mentioned, right? Like when you look at alcohol, or you look at whatever it may be, from the most acceptable to the most demonized drug. Um, you don't ask. You look at someone and say, "Oh, he's abusive as an alcoholic," but you don't ask why, what led him to that, right, or led her to that. And the thing is, how can, on a scale of which we need to address it, which is when millions are being affected, and the only solution being they're in prison, is what kind of system can we put into place to look at the why, as opposed to what they've done because of the why?
That's a great question, and whoever figures that out deserves a Nobel Prize. From my position, this I can say this having talked to thousands, so I have
Mm,
a pretty large sample size. There is not a single person that has walked through my door and told me their story who has not at least had one sentence or one moment that has absolutely broken my heart. I don't think I've ever dealt with someone who has not had a moment of just low. And similarly, everyone I've dealt with, even the worst of the worst, has done one or two things that make me proud of them as a human being. And I
mm,
think it's this understanding that human beings are incredibly complex. We're not the best thing we do, nor the worst thing we do. We're who we are on an average Tuesday.
mm.
And the solution, I think, is perhaps to begin with this, rather than to begin with the it's very, very easy when you're from a wealthy, successful background, you've been educated and you've received support, to look down your nose at someone who has nothing. It's
Yeah.
very different and very hard, and I think far more important to, if you're in a different position, help those people up and look at them like a human being and say, how can I help you, rather than how can I punish you? Because at the end of the day, it's whether the person was taking this, whether the person's taking the substance to run away from a trauma, whether they're taking the substance because they're a hedonist. The reality is, what can we do to stop them from taking the substance and show them better options? And if that's a criminal justice solution, fine. But if that's a social justice, or if that's a different solution, fine as well. We need those options.
And that's such a weird thing. Like in Bangalore, where there's, of course, like the rest of India, there's a huge disparity. Now you look at a laborer whose daily wages can barely get food on the table, but he spends, say, $50 on some really bad liquor, gets smashed, goes and beats up his wife. He's thrown into a prison where he's thrashed by the police. But then you have a celebrity's son who gets smashed on alcohol, maybe top shelf liquor, then drives drunk, runs over someone, but then gets scot free. And it's the same substance. It's the same underlying. Maybe both. Maybe one is economic pressure, and he's just not able to cope with this thing in the daily wage thing. But the other one may be an unloved child who knows, right? But
Yeah.
I'm saying that the outward result is someone getting hurt, which is either the wife or the person this guy ran over. But one is completely ruined by the system because he's beaten up, his legs are broken, he can't earn money. Now that's making the situation even worse. But one just gets away with it because of whose kid he is and the access he has to the I wouldn't say the benefit of doubt that the system gives. I'm not saying it always happens, but there've been a lot of examples where this happens. um,
Absolutely.
so it's very hard, to almost think like, I'm just speaking here as a layperson. When I look at, say, the way these substances are being distributed, right? Like there's a huge uptake of cocaine use in India now, and it seems to be it's not done in the poor population because, of course, it's an expensive drug. But there are things that people do when they want access to drugs, whatever the amount of money you have at disposal. But it almost feels, and this could sound like a conspiracy, and I don't mean to, but I'm coming to you from what I've read and what I've heard. Is there a purpose to these substances? Like when you say the substance is taken to cope, versus, is the substance even being put out there, distributed in legal and illegal channels, to create this unrest in society for a certain reason? And again, you don't have to answer as a lawyer, because I know there's a lot of speculation involved as a thing, but just as someone who's
Well,
seen so many cases.
I think, well, let's I want to address firstly your situation of the laborer versus the drunk driver.
Mm.
Instinctively, I think if 100% people heard that story, 99% of people would go, the laborer situation, while also awful, is much more understandable than the wealthy celebrities thing.
Yeah,
And it's because we, I think, human beings have a built-in sense of fair play. We are evolutionary, there's an evolutionary incentive to be community bonded, which is why loneliness is such a dangerous thing. And if someone is lonely, it's got enormous health implications. Like you would rather be obese and have a safe and a good community safety net than be in a relatively good cardiovascular shape and be socially isolated. That's worse for you. And the studies on that are pretty staggering sort of things. So I think we all have this inbuilt sense of fair play. When it comes to substances, my personal belief is this. I think there's that people in general, some firstly, for many people, they should never take any substances. They do not agree with them, and they can open doors you can't close. So if you don't take things, don't start taking things.
yeah.
Okay, because there are some people who take funny stuff and nothing bad happens, and there
Mm.
are others that will destroy your life. Don't roll that dice if you don't have to.
Yeah.
Secondly, when it comes to funny stuff, I think there's really three categories. There's stuff that makes people go fast,
Mm.
uppers, things like cocaine that you mentioned,
Mhm.
that people enjoy that feeling, that rush, that adrenaline. Then there's downers, things that slow you down, like opioids, and then there's things like hallucinogens, things who make you see things that aren't there, things like psilocybin, acid, etc. And I think the way people are, I think there's probably a physiological and physical basis that some agree with. I think part of the human experience is a sense of curiosity, and there is something intriguing about being in an altered state of mind.
Yeah.
Altered state of minds are what we really live for as human beings. The problem is, for many, there is something profoundly beautiful. I quite like being in the outdoors, and if you hike for an entire day and you reach the top of a nice mountaintop and you feel that air on your face, and you have you look over and you see a vista, or you hold your partner's hand. That is like being on top of the world. Now that is, but it's hard to do that. You have to take a day off work. You have to have the resources to go there. You have to hike for a day. You can get that from a small bump of a drug. It's
Yeah.
understandable why you would do that. And so it doesn't justify it, but it explains it. And I think one of the things is we need to stop this paternalistic telling people don't do that, it's bad, because
Yeah.
don't do that, it's bad has failed. Don't do that, it's bad should be part of the response. But if a parent, all they ever did was yell at their child, you would say that that parent is not a good parent, and
Mm.
that child is likely to grow up with some issues. For a parent to be an effective parent, they must have a mixture of love, fear, respect, all of these things. There needs to be this mix. And for us to simply take the fear approach, it's failed. And that's what
Mm.
is up. That's what's so upsetting, because um, you, people are going to cope with pressure in different ways.
Mhm.
Some are healthy and some are unhealthy. We need to make sure that people understand that, generally speaking, drugs are without it being under the supervision and care of experts. Drugs are a dangerous thing, and you should be very cautious if you're on them. But if you're going to take them anyway, no matter what people say, maybe we need to look at a way to minimize it. Maybe if that laborer is going to go get trashed and drunk, there needs to be some sort of system where he won't have access to his family or whatever have you.
Mm.
There,
Yeah.
there, there needs to be things in place. The reality
Yeah.
is, with wealth, you can insulate yourself from that. If you can go out and get absolutely trolleyed, the reason I think that story upsets people so much, that the person drinks and then drives, that guy can afford a chauffeur, that guy
Yeah.
can afford a cab, right? That laborer
Absolutely.
can't afford any other options. And for us, that's why when your world is so small, you don't have many options. That's kind of why I think for many people, it speaks to us differently, which was I hope I answered your
No,
question.
it's got me thinking to more questions. So thanks, because this idea of good and bad baffles me. Right, that there's a good child in class, there's a bad boy in class, there's a good student, a bad student, which might seem as something as simple as a classroom session where because he shouted, he's a bad student. But then those labels stick on, and then they become more and more limiting because the opportunity gets seems to reduce and seems to drive that person down a certain path which is predetermined by words being used at a young age, for good or bad. But then you see examples of people who drink, they smoke, they probably occasionally indulge in some weed, they might even indulge in some recreational drugs, but they're just helpful, good friends. But then you have someone who's fit, who goes running 30 marathons a month, who's a great student throughout his entire or her career, and ends up going and killing an entire family, right? So I'm saying there's absolutely no need for such distinct lines between good and bad.
Absolutely. Look, the things that are good in one context can be bad in another, and things that are
Mhm.
bad in a context, you know.
Yeah.
So, I have always been, I've always been, quite polite, and I've always been relatively kind. It's
Mhm.
something that I've had, and it when you're a kind person or when you're a polite person, there is a group of the population that, for some inexplicable reason, seems to think that kindness is a sign of weakness. And I,
Mm.
every year, without fail, 2 or 3 times, I need to pull someone aside and say, "I think you're mistaking my kindness for cowardice, and let me disabuse you of that right now. Because if you really want to get into it, I can show you the iron in me. I don't like doing that, but I can." Now, that assertiveness in one context is acceptable and in another it's not. It's perfectly fine to be aggressive if you're playing sports. It's, assuming you play within the rules, but it's not okay to be aggressive if you're, at a social event. And so it's quite sad and scary that people internalize many of these stories about who they are, and they
Yeah.
go down these roads. The number of people that I think have thrown their lives into a state of disarray because some awful adult told them they're stupid or they're worthless is
Mm.
profound.
Yeah.
It's profound. And the number of people who've had beautiful, meaningful, helpful lives because some adult took an interest in them when they were younger is also profound. I think we really need to rethink the way we speak to one another, and the way we speak to the younger generation, and the way we speak to ourselves. And it can go too far. We've all met those people who are absolutely confident with no basis to be. They are absolutely lacking in self-awareness. They are horrible. And that's not very good either.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think we have to be on this constant journey of, you know, this mixture of believing in ourselves and believing in the outside world, and kind of coming to an equilibrium and pushing ourselves while still, taking feedback on board, but disregarding feedback that's not effective or correct. And it's that's I think the journey of life, becoming good
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah. And just since we're on this topic of drugs, it's not like I want the entire conversation to be about it, but it seems like there are certain drugs that encourage violence and aggression. Like you hear of abuse after alcohol, or violence motivated by certain drugs. But then you hear people who are, and of course I'm not making any blanket statements or stereotypes, but then you hear people who are stoned or on an ayahuasca or psilocybin trip, who aren't really harming too many people except maybe the Instagram feed because of all these posts they put up. But yeah, I find that interesting, how certain people are attracted to certain kinds of substances, and as a result that leads them to make certain decisions which harm them and harm others. But then there are certain other decisions which take you down this path of self-discovery and self, as you said, this altered state, which seems to give you more of an introspective and a reflective journey, which ends up benefiting you and benefiting people around you. But then there's more abusive, self-abusive, and also externally abusive directions that people go in.
I mean, if you were to ask my own personal opinion, I think there is no drug more dangerous than alcohol. I think that
Mhm.
alcohol is probably responsible for more sadness, grief, and pain than any other drug in the world,
Yeah.
by a factor of 50 to 100, and it's
Mhm.
completely legal in most contexts.
Yeah.
And I think that there are people who swear by the fact they had a psilocybin, experience that changed their life and brought them a sense of peace and clarity. There are studies that show that, for example, MDMA, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or ecstasy, if used in a clinical context, can help soldiers and people suffering from extreme PTSD. There's evidence that ketamine, which is a horse tranquilizer, can be used to deal with extreme depression. These are
Mm.
things that are worth exploring. One of the things that breaks my heart is that we have these tools that no one can utilize in any way, shape, or form because they're labeled as these dangerous substances. Now, there is absolutely, in my opinion, a need to protect the general public from people just grabbing these things and going crazy.
Yeah.
But for us to say that there's no benefit to them whatsoever is also crazy.